interviewing. It's filmmaker John Little. He directed and produced Leonard Peikoff in his own words. He's done a project about Mike Mentzer, the bodybuilder. And we're going to learn all about his career and much more. I want to ask you to leave a like, hit that join button, and send us your super chats, questions, and support. And we've also got my co-host here today. Here's a guy who he works out harder than Mike Mentzer, hoping to someday be in the same weight class as me so we can have a daily objective tournament. It's Mark Pellegrino.
What's up, man?
Hey, do you actually work out a lot? You seem like you're a boxer, right?
Yes, I was, but I did work out a lot. And Mike was I was a fan of Mike in the 80s. I used to see his stuff in bodybuilding magazines, and I tried to emulate his style a bit. He made me quite a bit stronger following some of his routines. At one point in my life, I was able to bench close to 400 pounds because of him.
That's amazing. But hey, John Little also, we should have just kept this conversation going for the next 10 minutes while keeping our guests waiting. But John, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So I guess, how did you end up kind of making documentaries about some of these people? So were you an Ayn Rand fan once upon a time? Is that what kind of brought you into contact with someone like Leonard Peikoff?
Well, no, actually, to be honest, I was a fan of Leonard Peikoff before I was a fan of Ayn Rand. And I used to objectivist thought through Mike Mentzer, who was a real advocate. But as far as getting into documentaries, no, that was a convoluted path. I'll try and make it a very short story, but what had happened is I had acquired the video rights to an interview with Bruce Lee. And it was shot in 1971 in Hong Kong and proved to be the only surviving interview that he ever did. And I got approached by a guy from Australia who claimed to be a great filmmaker, and he claimed he had the rights to a television show that Bruce Lee appeared in called Longstreet. And what I remembered about Longstreet was it was all about Bruce Lee's approach to martial art, this particular episode. And he spoke in his own voice, and it was Bruce Lee being Bruce Lee. So I thought, wow, what a cool concept if we took this interview and we married it with the Longstreet footage, and Bruce Lee could essentially tell his own story in his own words. So this fellow assured me that he was the man for the job. So he cobbled together a video, and it was awful. He accomplished what I thought the impossible, which he made Bruce Lee boring. So unfortunately, the video, when it came out, also had clips from some American Warner Brothers based films, Enter the Dragon, for example. And since this fellow lived in Australia and I at the time was living in California, I envisioned that I had a big bullseye on me. And if Warner Brothers wanted to come at anyone for copyright infringement, because I never saw a license for these clips, I would be the guy. So I thought I'd better do a mea culpa. And I contacted Warner Brothers and said, I want to come in and talk to you guys. I think there's a problem. And so I was brought into the office of a fellow named Brian Jameson. And I told him the story. I said, I'm really sorry I didn't put this together. I requested repeatedly a copy of the permissions to use this footage. I haven't got it. And basically, do what you got to do. And I got a completely unanticipated response. The fellows stepped back and said, well, what do you think of the film? And I said, I think it's terrible. He said, do you think you could do a better job? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, why don't you do it? We have a 25th anniversary of Enter the Dragon coming out. Why don't you do a documentary on Bruce and also write a book on Enter the Dragon? And can you do it in 7 days? So it was a baptism by fire. So that was my first film. I delivered it on time, and it did very well. It won the Toronto and the Montreal film festivals, and was given a standing room only.
What was that called? That film?
Bruce Lee in his own words.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I might have seen that as a kid. Bruce Lee was like my first hero as a kid. I thought he was so cool and strong. And I remember seeing one Bruce Lee movie that was a lot more talking. So I'll be honest, I was 7 and I was disappointed. I wanted more of a movie. But
Yeah.
now I'd be totally into that type of thing. But yeah, at that age, I just wanted to see some ass whooping, like him versus Chuck Norris in that one movie. But that's so interesting. So that might have been the one you produced, or maybe it was the boring one that I disliked as a kid. Wouldn't that?
Maybe
be cool?
that was mine. Yeah. But anyway, that was my intro to filmmaking. But in particular, the in his own words concept. Mm-hmm. And fast forwarding, when Mike had told me all about Ayn Rand and Objectivism, and I was a student in philosophy in university, so I love philosophy. So he was preaching to the choir, and I was quite taken with what I'd learned about the objectivist metaphysics. And so, anyway, I still couldn't grasp Ayn Rand as a seminal philosophical figure. And the reason was my own prejudice, which was that she was a novelist. She was dealt in fiction primarily. And I couldn't make the nexus between real world philosophy and fiction writing until a friend of mine told me, well, what do you think Plato's dialogues were? That's philosophy. And it was like, oh, okay. But I was still hesitant. So I ordered Leonard's, what was it called? I think it was the Philosophy of Objectivism lecture series. And it was 36 hours and audio cassette, and listened to it over the course of 1 week. And I came away very impressed with Leonard Peikoff. And so I always liked Leonard. Leonard was my guy, and because he'd been in the trenches of the universities and been exposed to all the various philosophies and had come out with objectivism, I was really impressed by that. So once, I think it was in early 2000, I thought, well, I'm going to screw up the courage and approach him and see if he would be interested in doing an in his own words documentary. And to my surprise, he was. So that's how that film came about.
That's so interesting. Oftentimes the people that everyone's afraid to approach are actually the most, it's almost the opposite. It's like a beautiful woman, people assume, oh, she's probably taken, or I'm not her type. And then at her end, nobody's approaching her. Similarly, I mean, if somebody's as prominent in a certain field like Peikoff, or just famous in other ways, people don't want to bother them. But it turns out they're kind of eager to be approached in some cases. So that's really cool. Now, was your Mike Mentzer project before you ever worked with Peikoff?
Well, I'd written about Mike and his approach to training for a number of years, but the project that Mike and I worked together on, which was a book called High Intensity Training the Mike Mentzer Way, we had worked on that, and then Mike died. So the manuscript had been written, but the photo selection and all of that sort of rigmarole still had to follow. So I followed through on that. And then, as Mike was a good friend, he's been dead now, 21 years. I had a wealth of archival material, interviews on tape that I'd done and things like that. And it just dawned on me that it would be nice to have his voice heard in the fitness landscape these days. So about 8 months ago, I started putting together videos and threw them up on my YouTube channel of Mike, and they've been very well received, which pleases me, because it means that Mike's legacy is continuing on for another generation at least.
Yeah. Did you, or are you thinking of like turning those clips into like an official release?
Well, at the moment, I'm just putting them up on YouTube because one thing I've learned in filmmaking is that it's an uphill battle to get funding for any project. And a Mike Mentzer project, fascinating though it is, would take a lot of convincing on my part to a production company, and they would be rightly concerned as to whether or not there was a market for it. There's the zealots like myself, of course, who would, I would love to see anything that anybody did on Mike, but we are a very small minority, and certainly not enough to warrant throwing big money at a proper production.
Well, so I've heard Mentzer worked with, or he knew and worked around Schwarzenegger, who's another childhood hero of mine. Now, Mark, you anything you ever wanted to ask Mentzer that you might be able to ask John and see if he knows the answer, or anything else?
I actually just bought one of John's books on Amazon, so I should be getting it in a couple of days, because I'm definitely looking for new ways of training. And in my younger years, I followed Mike's work and tried to emulate it a bit to the best of my ability. But for people who don't know what he did, can you encapsulate it for people, like how he was able to achieve such, high intensity work? The guy was strong. I didn't know he was not only strong, but he could do high repetitions at incredible weight. And I sort of emulated that. Can you give us a little insight into how he was able to do that kind of stuff?
Well, the snapshot of Mike is that he was the anti-Arnold. Arnold was in the gym 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, and that's what he recommended to everyone. So you had to do it every day. You have to train every day. It has to be part of your lifestyle. And he was basically a shill for Joe Weider. He sold protein product for Joe Weider. And Arnold was the type of guy who was quite willing to barter his integrity for $1. He had no problem with that. Mike, on the other hand, came from a pre-med background. So he was always science, results, logical consistency oriented. That was his thing. And during his seminars, when he became popular, he would say, he would argue about the role of genetics in building strength and size, which nobody ever touched before because there wasn't a return on it, and he would say, people would invariably ask him, well, Arnold trains, 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, and you're advocating only training half an hour, 3 days a week. And Mike said, yeah, because it really has to do, steroids aside, in professional bodybuilding, it has to do with your genetics. If you have the genetic potential to build large muscles, you don't need to be in the gym that often. They will develop, providing the intensity is high. And intensity and duration exist in an inverse ratio. The more intense an exercise is, which is better for stimulating muscle growth, the briefer the workout has to be. But the more intense the workout is, the longer it takes to recover from it. So you can't be training 6 days a week. And if you're training for 3 hours a day, you're not training hard. You're not training intense, because you can do it for 3 hours. To sprinting, he said, if you look at the calves of a sprinter and compare them with the calves of a distance runner, the sprinter always has a large muscular calf. The distance runner always has a small, stringy little calf. And he said, and the reason is the distance runner is so chronically overtrained. He does so much that his body can't produce the muscle growth that the workouts are asking of it, whereas the sprinter does very compact, concentrated bursts of high intensity muscular activity. It doesn't do anywhere near the volume that a distance runner does, and consequently, he develops a more muscular physique. So when he was asked about Arnold, he said, here's the thing, if it was Arnold's training methods that were solely responsible for the muscular development that he displays, there'd be a lot more Arnolds running around because everybody trains that way. He goes, Arnold is the way he is because A, he had tremendous genetics to develop muscle, and B, he's a professional bodybuilder. He takes steroids, just like all of us do. He said, so it's not the training method, that Arnold embraced. He grew in spite of his training practices. Now, this was anathema to Arnold and his employer, because it basically said you don't need to take Joe Weider's protein or any protein supplement. You just need to train hard and pay attention to issues such as recovery. Now, Mike would cite science studies and physiologists to back up his conclusions in the matter, whereas Arnold would cite tradition typically. He trained the way he did because his idol, a bodybuilder named Reg Park, trained that way in the 50s. So it was a tradition-based approach to training. So Mike and Arnold were not friends. They did not get along. Mike thought Arnold was deceiving the public, and Arnold thought Mike was cutting into his business. And so they did not get along at all.
Interesting. The pro-capitalist of them actually was he was disillusioned with Arnold's cheap shilling of a poor lifestyle. Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, it seems like that shorter duration of workout with the higher intensity is especially good for people who are getting older, who can't work out, for 3 hours at a time, not only because you don't have the time, but your body really can't take that kind of overstimulation. It seems perfect for people in their 40s, 50s, who should adjust their workout routines. Do you think that's
exactly.
true?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a type of thing where when you're stimulating as many fibers as possible, the slow, intermediate, and fast twitch fibers in any given muscle group, our ancestors would not have done that on a routine basis. It would have been a fight or flight situation that caused that. And fight or flight situations were not daily occurrences, from 2 to 4. They were random. You
Right.
might not have an incident of that for a month or 2 months or 4 months. So our bodies never evolved a means by which it had to have an immediate recovery for fast twitch fibers. And so if you're going to tap those fibers, you simply have to pay attention to their recovery window, which is not instant or 24 hours. And that's just recovery. It's a 3-phase process. One is to stimulate growth. Second is to recover from the energy output and micro damage caused by the workout. And then the third is the adaptation, the benefit that you're looking for, a bigger, stronger muscle. And it follows that triphasic matrix: stimulate, recover, grow. And if you work out again before you have grown, you won't grow. You'll just stimulate, recover, stimulate, recover, stimulate, recover, and flatline. So Mike's view was far more science-based, far more reason-based. And once he got heavily into objectivism, he saw the benefit of principles such as the law of identity and law of causality, and made that application to the training too, so that he could formulate a training theory that was non-contradictory, much like Ayn Rand did with her philosophy.
That's what I'm curious about. Go ahead, Mark. I'll
sorry. I'm just
no. Go.
Really interesting to me. When you would see a bodybuilder, typically, especially in the 70s, 80s, they were huge, but they did not seem athletic. How much? And I think he was athletic, but how much do you think his training style has influenced, say, UFC? Where you see people who have, I think what could be considered in some cases a bodybuilder's physique, but they're flexible and athletic at the same time. Do you think any of his training has influenced some of their training styles, or is it something completely different? I'm
not aware of Mike's training methods going into the UFC. Martial arts, that's another interesting world, but they are also traditionalists, typically. Mm-hmm. So they train the way they did because they're told to train that way. There's very few independent thinkers in the martial arts world. So whoever your jiu-jitsu coach is or your striking coach, you're going to do what they tell you to do. And if the UFC had occurred in the 1950s, they wouldn't have them lifting weights at all, because weight training was frowned upon in the 50s. So you'd become muscle bound. You couldn't. It was actively discouraged by high school athletic coaches. We know more about it now, but unfortunately, the whole industry, almost since its inception, has been founded on commercial interests, which are, and there's nothing wrong with commercialism. The problem is when you take the public for fools, and you're looking basically to line your pockets by selling pixie dust, which is what most of the supplements are. And they're sold with the premise that you too can change who you are and become this other person if you take this. And so, a lot of the strength coaches get their information, like we all did at one point, out of the muscle magazines. And very few of the articles in muscle magazines that bear a given champion's byline are written by him. There's a bank of writers, or there was when I worked for Joe Weider, where there was a staff of writers that did all the writing. Bodybuilders didn't write anything. So if there are independent thinkers in the MMA world, then the chances of them embracing what Mike advocated is much greater. But, again, Mike's been dead for 21 written an article in 21 years. So unless you're exposed to him somehow, some way, he's not on the radar.
Would you say you agree with Mentzer through and through, to the extent you understand what he was talking about? Like, because I know there are other schools of thought out there that conflict with him.
I absolutely agree wholeheartedly with Mike. And it's interesting because any research that I have done supports what Mike has said. And it didn't start out that way. For example, Mike Mentzer said in the 90s that because as you grow stronger in your workouts, the demands on your body grow greater. So the demands on your recovery ability is increased. Consequently, he said you have to compensate for that, make allowances for it. So what he found out was that most trainees, as they get closer to their genetic potential, will have to train as intensely as they can, which now is considerably more intense than when they started. They're stronger, the weights are bigger, their effort output is greater. The amount of glycogen and other energy reserves within the muscle is utilized at a greater rate. And so he said, it's not inconceivable that most trainees at that point of their training will only need to do maybe 2 or 3 sets once every 7 to 10 days.
Wow.
And that was heresy in the bodybuilding world. Like you must be out of your mind. 3 sets, I can't even warm up with 3 sets. You're telling me that's all I need every 7 to 10 days? Well, fast forwarding, I opened a training facility in 1994, and we acquired a machine called a bod pod. And a bod pod is a very sophisticated body composition testing machine. It looks like a space capsule. And it operates on Boyle's gas law, which is a displacement, heat energy displacement value. And it's very accurate. It's right up there with underwater or hydrostatic weighing. And we wanted to do a fat loss study because most people that come to a gym are interested in losing weight. So I knew that if we could increase their muscle mass, we would keep their metabolic rates high, which meant they could burn calories on a daily basis at a greater rate than people who had less muscle mass. So we started out with once a week training, 6 exercises to cover the whole body. And every 2 weeks, we would reduce the amount of calories in their diet. And we provided them the menus, the shopping lists, the recipes, the whole bit. And when they came in to get their composition tested 2 weeks after we started, I found that they had lost fat, which we expected because they were in a calorie deficit, but they'd also lost muscle, which is not what I wanted. So I thought, well, maybe they're pacing themselves in their workouts, and consequently, they're not investing 100% in any one set. So I'll cut them back to 4 exercises once a week. So we did that. 2 weeks later, they came in, we put them back in the bod pod, and we checked their composition. And once again, they'd lost fat, but they'd also lost muscle. So now I was flummoxed. It's like I couldn't envision a workout being less than 4 sets total. I mean, that's basically 4 minutes of exercise. But then I thought, well, they are in a calorie deficit. So maybe there's some sort of biological issue going on here that is mitigating the results that I was looking for. So I cut them back to 3 once a week. And 2 weeks later, they came in and tested, and we found that they had lost fat again, which was great. And they didn't gain muscle, but they didn't lose any. So now I saw a pattern. 6 sets once a week, lose muscle. 4 sets once a week, lose muscle. 3 sets once a week, maintain muscle. That suggested that maybe 2 sets once a week might be recoverable in 7 days. So I was a little worried that it might be too little exercise. So I cut the group in half. And the one group that I knew would maintain muscle, I kept them at 3 sets. The other group I put to 2 sets. And 2 weeks later, they came in and tested. And the group that did 2 sets once a week gained muscle. So this turned everything on its head, but it also validated what Mike hypothesized about it in the 1990s. 2 sets. He said, 2 sets once every 7 to 10 days. So
wow, that
yeah.
is mind blowing.
But that it's funny. I mean, we don't. Mike said to me once. He said, all these years we've been asking ourselves the wrong question. So the question we've been asking is, how much exercise can I tolerate? He said, the real question is, how little is required? And that has resonated with me. Because it's become a ritual, it's become a social institution. But as far as the physiological need, you don't need to be in the gym every day, clearly. And Mike also made the comment that whenever Mike went away on a holiday or his clients went on a holiday, they were typically gone for 2 weeks. And when they came back, all of their weights went up. So he said, there's something to this. This isn't just an anomaly. This is almost the rule. If they take 2 weeks out of the gym, all their numbers go up. They're stronger. So unlike the old thing that we were taught, that muscles, atrophy or decompensate after 96 hours, that's quite the opposite. They were stronger after a 2-week break.
No matter what their aged, or just just
right across the board. Yeah. Huh. I would suspect that if you're older, that would have even more relevance, because our recovery ability is not what it is when we're in our 60s as what it was when we were in our 20s.
Right.
So Mike was fascinated by that and got very excited about the idea that, hey, we're breaking new ground here. But he did it in the teeth of an industry that didn't want to hear about it. As you probably know, the template for most gyms is to open in a population dense area. And they dazzle you with options. We've got an aerobics room, we got a sauna, we got a free weight room, we got a machine room, we got a yoga class, we got a juice bar, yada, yada, yada. And the idea is, you think perceived value. Look at all that stuff. And then they say, nah, the best part, it's only going to cost you this. Mm-hmm. You can't get your name on the contract quick enough. So you sign up for whatever the amount is, and there's an automatic withdrawal every month, and you don't show up. And that's what they count on, because if everybody showed up, you couldn't work out. So what happens is, when people drop out, that's okay, because a whole new crop of people are coming in through the turnstile. It's all turnover. And what they're in is not the health business, they're in the membership business. And they're good at selling it. But Mike was really interested in, what are the nuts and bolts of this thing? Like, what are the requirements for a human being to get stronger, increase his functional ability so that you can do more things in life, and then take a macro perspective on it and say, there's a hell of a lot more that life has to offer than just hanging out in the gym. So, anyone who trains, you should do the least amount you need to, and spend your other time developing your mind, or, cultivating other interests, learning another language, you name it. So that was Mike's message. But in an industry that is based on selling supplements and turnover, that's not a message they wanted to promote. Because if you wrote, hey, you only need to train once a week, 2 to 3 exercises, you don't need the supplements, just eat proper and well-balanced diet like you were taught in high school, what do they write about next month? It's got to be this magic bean for that, and you do this exercise for the outer 1/16 of your biceps, and it's just smoke and mirrors. It's like the Emperor's New Clothes or the Wizard of Oz. Mike ripped the curtain back and recognized that the Great Oz wasn't very great.
Mm-hmm. The question that you quoted Mentzer asking, which is, instead of asking how much like working out are we able to do, rather ask how little is required, something like that. Right. And that I can see a little bit of like a parallel to Ayn Rand's view of production. Whereas like the Marxist view is sort of like labor is everything. Like it's all about labor. Whereas to Rand, it's about the mind making plans. It's about the mind's planning out, and then you devise technologies and efficient production that saves you a bunch of time and saves you a bunch of labor. So let me ask John, like your journey into objectivism is different from a lot of people. So a lot of us, we read Rand's novels, and we're inspired. And then if we're curious, we find out she's got a philosophy and that there's someone named Leonard Peikoff. And then finally, one day we learn the word metaphysics, and we kind of begrudgingly learn why that matters. And then we see why it matters. Now, you were enamored by the metaphysics from the start. You found out who Leonard Peikoff is right away first, and begrudgingly got around to the novel. So this is not so much a question. It's more like a comment, but is that, what do you think?
Yeah, that's accurate. I had no interest in wading through a book as big as Atlas Shrugged. You know, it was like, Jesus, if you can't tell me what your philosophy is in, paragraph, I wasn't really interested. But I knew that there was more to it. And I knew that Leonard brought a certain gravitas to it in his lectures, and a wit that I liked. Leonard's a sharp, funny guy. And other philosophers that I'd read in the past, whom I enjoyed reading, I didn't necessarily agree with their philosophy, but I enjoyed their writing, was like Bertrand Russell, who was very witty, very sharp. And I detected elements of that in Peikoff, but he had a sound metaphysics, which was really kind of intriguing to me. And he placed objectivism within the history, the chronology of the development of philosophy. And that, as a student of philosophy, I found very intriguing. And, unlike the many vitriolic attacks on Rand and objectivism, I thought, here is a man who could easily diffuse each and every one of those arguments, because he understood the subject matter. He knew what ammunition the opposition had, and he'd already figured out exactly how to disarm them, and could. So I was very impressed with Leonard, and whenever Leonard did anything, I was following it. When I was doing the film with Leonard, he said, "Oh, I'm going to West Point." Right away, the bells went. I thought, wow, last objectivist at West Point was Ayn Rand. This is really cool. This is historical. So I said, well, I want to come and I want to film it. And he said, yeah, sure. So, packed up a camera crew, off we went to West Point. We filmed Leonard's 2 talks that he gave. And I think Yaron Brook was there, and Leonard's daughter was there. And we interviewed them. And that was great, because they're in there. And what was cool, again, my mind's going now, but when I was at Leonard's house to see his actual typed presentations of the philosophy of objectivism, the history of Western philosophy, all things that I'd listened to, and there was the original document. That was cool. And then he had Ayn Rand's artifacts, her ashtray, other things like the first editions of her books. And I was very, very impressed. And I got what he was talking about when he said that she presented to him a sunlit universe. It was just, it was California, it was Leonard Peikoff, it was these free thinking, free will, reasonable, non-contradictory life. And it was fascinating. And the heroic, he was very big on the heroic, as was Ayn Rand. And he told me, he said, you really ought to do something on Ayn Rand. And I was like, I'm happy with what I got. I'm good with Leonard Peikoff. And he said, if I'd known about you, I would have given you Atlas Shrugged. I thought, well, that's quite a compliment. But, again, I do documentaries. I'm not a feature film guy. And
it's becoming a documentary.
What's that?
Atlas Shrugged is becoming a documentary, the way the world is going. Just a wisecrack. Sorry to interrupt.
But he said, well, why don't you do Ayn Rand in her own words? And I thought about it. And to me, I was happy with Leonard Peikoff. I was good with that. Anything I needed to know about objectivism, I got from Leonard. And I thought Leonard's got, this is going to be heresy, but he's got more authority when he speaks philosophically because he's got a PhD in philosophy. He went through the trenches, and so I had this tremendous respect for Leonard, but he kept saying, Ayn Rand, should do Ayn Rand, do Ayn Rand. And part of it was ignorance on my part. I hadn't read anything. I think I'd thumbed through philosophy, who needs it, and that was about it. So I thought, all right, I better do some homework here to see if I can do it justice. Otherwise, I shouldn't do it at all. Leave it to someone else who's got the passion. So I sat down and I read Atlas Shrugged cover to cover, and then it was The Fountainhead cover to cover, and then it was the Romantic Manifesto, and then it was her other books. So I ended up reading all of her books. And again, I thought, wow, this is, and watching the interviews and watching her mind work was fascinating to me. It was like watching an Olympic athlete at the top of his game, but intellectually. And so anyway, I contacted Leonard. I said, well, if you want me to do it, I think I can do it. So he said, yeah, great. So anyway, he opened basically the vault, the archive to me. So I had 40 hours of Ayn Rand's epistemology workshop, audio cassettes that I listened to. And, and interviews that were done with her talking about her life, which was imperative to this. And we ended up putting together, and Leonard, to me, when I did the Bruce Lee film, in my mind, the only audience I had was one person, and that was his widow. If she was impressed by it, then I knew I did my job right. And she told me, oh, it was like Bruce was in the room with me again. I thought, great, okay, I succeeded. If someone else liked it, that's fine, but that wasn't why I did it. With Leonard, my audience was me. I was like, I like this guy. I know what I want to get out of him. And he gave it to me, and that was awesome. That was gold. It was purely, selfish reasons why I wanted to do Leonard. Mm-hmm. Ayn Rand, I had to be, because I respected Leonard's opinion, I had to be pulled into it by him. But once I got into it and I could see what he saw through his eyes, what impressed him, that's what I went with, and he became my audience. If Leonard watched the documentary with his passion for Ayn Rand and came away saying, what the hell did you do to her? Like, you've ruined it. Then I would have, A, been crushed, but B, I would have recognized that I can't do this film. But instead he said, to me now, if I want to spend an hour with Ayn Rand, I reach for that film. So that was good. I felt I succeeded. And along the way, I got to know her quite well. And by extension, I got to learn how hostile certain camps are out there to Ayn Rand.
What film? What's that film called?
Ayn Rand in Her Own Words.
Oh, okay.
Now, where can people get these films?
Well, they used to be available through the Ayn Rand Institute. I don't know now. I hadn't had a big marketing push for this because, again, I kind of did it for Leonard, and I thought, well, the biggest objectivist Ayn Rand audience is going to be through the Institute, so it just makes sense to sell it there. So that's what I did. I probably should make it available as a streaming video for people, but I haven't done that yet.
Well, we can all look into that and post a comment letting people know. But that's interesting. I have Leonard Peikoff in his own words on DVD. Actually, yeah. I have quite a collection of DVDs. Not something people brag about much anymore. Mm-hmm. So in that documentary, Peikoff talks about the first time meeting Rand when he was about 17, and that evening he was so wired that he was like, I need to wash my hands in a new kind of way. Like, everything's different now. Yeah. Did you have an experience meeting Peikoff that was sort of transformative on some level that you recall? Must have been cool, at least.
Not really, because before I met him in person, we had spoken on the phone. We did a lot of pre-interviews, so I could create a database for the film. So. There was that surreal effect the first time I was speaking to him on the phone, for sure, because, I knew the voice. It was like listening to the lectures again. There he is. Leonard, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And that was really cool. And I got to ask him questions during our phone interviews leading up to the film that had always been on my mind, issues, connections I couldn't make, going from the what is to the what ought to be. That was always a big obstacle for me, because in my mind it was like, well, what is, that's what it is, that's reality. What ought to be, by definition, is not this, otherwise it would be that. So, how can you go from this and then claim that this is reality? That was a tough one for me. And
for many, obviously.
So, Leonard, explained his interpretation of that, which was acceptable, obviously. And the other one I had was man. Aristotle's definition of man is the rational animal. And I asked him, I said, you've been around a long time, and you've had all sorts of debates and arguments and all sorts of stuff. I said, would it not be a more accurate definition that man is the potentially rational animal? Because oftentimes he does not behave rationally. And he disagreed with me on that, and told me why. Essentially it was like the what is versus the what ought to be. It was almost the same argument, but different thing. So it was kind of cool to have. It was like having private lessons with Leonard Peikoff in philosophy, so it doesn't get much better than that.
Doesn't get much better than that.
Can I just say something real quick? Ayn Rand, in her own words, is available on Amazon Prime for $1.99 if you want to rent it. I think $9.99 if you want to buy it. But Leonard Peikoff, in his own words, is currently unavailable. So if anybody out there in the audience wants to see John's work, you can immediately catch Ayn Rand in her own words. And of course, I got your book, one of your books, coming to me very soon. So I can't wait to read it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, that's right. We've got on Prime Video, you could stream Ayn Rand in her own words, starring Ayn Rand. Or you can order the DVD Ayn Rand in her own words, starring Phil Donahue. So that's great.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, let's read some super chats. Marilyn, thank you for the $5. And then Marilyn again with $3. Katie asks, hi, Mark. Can I ask who has inspired you throughout your life? Is it me?
Probably.
Is this to me?
Yeah.
Is this a question? This is a question to me?
It's to you.
Oh, well, I mean, Ayn Rand, of course. Right. Founding fathers. I could come up with probably a dozen or so people who I think are heroic and have inspired me through my life.
And add John Little, I think, to that list. And Apollo, thank you. He says, hanging out with John Little, Flex Magazine. Is Flex Magazine?
I used to write for Flex Magazine back in the 90s. Yeah.
And that sounds like a workout related publication.
Yeah, it was a bodybuilding publication, one of several that Joe Weider published at the time.
Nice.
That was a long time ago. Yeah.
Just quickly, whatever happened to Joe Weider? Is he still around, or did he pass?
No, he passed away, and his brother Ben passed away.
I mean, he had an empire there in the 80s and 90s.
Well, I remember when he had sold 50% of his supplement company, and I was out for lunch with him. And Joe always wore a suit, so he'd taken a suit jacket off, so the inside breast pocket was exposed. And he got up and went to the bathroom. And I looked at the pocket on his suit jacket that was over his chair, and he had a check for $1 million that he hadn't cashed. But he'd sold 50% or 49% of his supplement company for $400 million.
Wow.
So, I mean, he was dealing with some pretty heavy numbers back then. I mean, to me, I was just a writer at the time, an employee of Joe's, and to see a check that he didn't even bother to cash for $1 million in his pocket,
madness.
Pretty heady stuff.
Marilyn asks, does John know Doug McGuff?
Yes, I co-authored a book with Doug called Body by Science. And Doug's another fascinating guy. He's probably the brightest mind in exercise science, in my opinion. He was a guy that, like Leonard, the way we did the book is I would phone Doug and we would have a topic, and I'd tell Doug what the topic was going to be the week before, and he would comb through the medical literature. And then, as a guy who's an ER surgeon, I mean, he has people's hearts in his hand every day, so he knows how the human body works. And as a side business, he has a gym, much like my own, just a private training center. We do high intensity training. And his average workout for his clients is about 12 minutes once a week. So
that's unbelievable.
But with Doug, as with Leonard, to me, it was like I was getting private tuition in physiology, or not tuition, but education. And so I learned a great deal in researching and writing that book with Doug. And that was my reward. My selfish reward was getting the knowledge from this man and then converting it into words, and putting it into a book that we had our names on. But he's a great guy, number one, and also a fellow who's very conversant with objectivism, and is, like I say, the perfect spokesman now for high intensity training because of his medical background and his experience in training.
John, where are you based at? Where are you based out of? Where's your gym?
Our facility is in an area called Muskoka, which is an hour and a half north of Toronto. So in the province of Ontario in Canada.
Huh. So you and Dr. Peikoff sort of passed each other in life. He started in North Canada and ended up in California.
I think he was the West Coast, actually. He was
right.
We're on the East Coast. He was on the West Coast. And then he went to California, and I went to California to meet him eventually. But yeah. Quite a guy. I like Leonard tremendously. He was very good to me, and just a very impressive intellect. I mean, just having dinner with him was, exciting, and asking whatever question came into your mind. It was great. And I remember asking him. I was saying, well, one thing I noticed in the Bruce Lee world and in the bodybuilding world was that you get a lot of people to just parrot what somebody says, like Ayn Rand. They'll throw out a maxim or a statement, which doesn't really indicate that they know what they're talking about. They just know that you like this person. Here's a quote from this person. Therefore, you and I now have. And I said, are there some objectivists that simply bore you to tears because it's like talking to yourself? And he said, yeah. He said, there's some objectives I don't care for at all. And he said, but that's not really my concern. He said, I would much rather have dinner with a dedicated communist than some of these people. He said, because the communist, if he was sincere and had reasons for holding his views, that would be a much more interesting conversation. As opposed to someone that's just apathetic and goes along and A is A. Yeah, okay. It doesn't, there's nothing that's stimulating about that. It's just an echo chamber. So I always remembered that. And Mike Mentzer was of the same opinion. But I find that with myself. I don't tend to be as dismissive of someone who holds a different viewpoint from my own. I want to hear what the reasoning is and then see where the fault lies in the reasoning. That's an interesting exercise for me, because usually you can find where they went off the rails somewhere with that. But if they're sincere about it, I think that speaks to sense of life, right? And if they have a benevolent sense of life, we can still get along, but we'll try and work on the higher abstractions of that as we go along. But if someone comes to me and says, "Oh, I'm an objectivist," and assumes we're going to be buddies, that doesn't mean anything.
And I imagine Leonard Peikoff has met just the worst of the worst of self-identified objectivists. And I would think the John Littles and the Mike Mentzers and the Mark Pellegrinos of the world who are so physically active and working in reality it's a good way to not become rationalistic and hyper intellectual in a way that's detached from the facts on the ground. So people stay busy and be physical. Be physical in your life. Don't be.
It's the old Grecian ideal, right? Of a healthy mind and a healthy body, and the mind resides within the body. So you've got to pay attention to that. Most bodybuilders don't. They just go by rote, and it's everything from the neck down. And a lot of the academics are the opposite. They're from the neck up, don't do anything down. But it's not an either or. It's not a bifurcacious thing. You can integrate the two, and should.
I'm aiming to someday live from the knees down. I have amazingly gifted calves, and if
Lucky
I could
you.
just, yeah.
If I had your calves, I'd wear shorts all year round.
I basically do. Now I live in Texas. It's mostly pretty hot. Enric says, thanks you for the useful knowledge on fitness. And then Bonnie, thank you as well. And then Katie asks, thank you, Mark, for the book club on Twitter. What's your favorite book of all time?
People ask me my favorite book of all time. And, I it's like asking me my favorite actor of all time. I really can't go there. I have a list of, I think, a top 10, but certainly anything by Ayn Rand would be in that top 10. So check out Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, or We Are Living, or even her little book, Anthem, and you'll find something in there that I think will be edifying.
John, would you say you have a favorite book, or is it similar to Mark's answer?
I'm not really a guy that's had his life changed by reading a book. It's strange to say. In fact, about a year ago, I had 2,000 books in my library. I think I'm down to about 500 now. I just purged them. I remember Alan Watts, the Zen interpreter, philosopher, saying that once you get the message, hang up the phone. And the thing is, once I got something out of a book, I didn't need to go back to it again. I've got it, and so, I'm not taking up shelf space with it. So I'm not. Leonard had a eureka experience when he discovered the Fountainhead. I never had that. I don't know why. It would be nice if I could find a book that suddenly, all the scales fell off my eyes and I saw the truth. I haven't had that experience. So mine has been more of a struggle in the streets rather than in the bookstores or the libraries.
Apollo asks, did John ever meet Arthur Jones, and how did it go if he did?
I never did. I would have liked to have met Arthur, but in the same way that Leonard was my guy for objectivism, Mike Mentzer was my guy for high intensity training. And Mike learned a lot from Arthur, but to me, if the only valuable stuff I needed to learn from Arthur, Mike already told me. So I didn't need to go that route. And similarly, it was my experience with objectivism, the way I came to it, that anything I needed to learn of the philosophy, qua philosophy of objectivism, I got from Leonard. And Ayn Rand wouldn't alter that. It wouldn't. It would augment it to some degree. That this is the source, and that's kind of cool. But Leonard, to me he wrote Opar. Ayn Rand never wrote a complete presentation of her philosophy. It was always in various books. Aesthetics was in the Romantic Manifesto. Epistemology was a book unto itself. I'm not aware that she wrote a book on metaphysics, for example, but Leonard did. So to me, he was my guy. Leonard was the go-to guy for the philosophy. I get now that aesthetics is crucial, and Ayn Rand took all of that massive landscape of philosophy and put it into aesthetic form, so that you could see how it played out. The problems with collectivism, for example. Here's an example, in a scenario, rather than as an abstraction, or as she would say, a free-floating abstraction. So, I've grown to appreciate that gift that she had so much more now, because that is where the artist comes out. No one has painted philosophical pictures like Ayn Rand ever. So I, weird long answer to your listener's question, but no, I never met Arthur Jones.
That's so, Rand's contribution to philosophy, I think, includes kind of like the role of philosophy and its relationship to aesthetics, and the way that art ends up transmitting philosophy in ways we don't even realize usually in life. And like Rand's process of devising her philosophy seems to kind of be almost an accident in a way. Like she wanted to create these characters, and then she kind of conceptualized the philosophy of these characters. That's kind of like my impression.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Yeah, very rich stuff. Ali says, Mark, how are you not tired? Lol. A lot of questions for Mark.
Yeah. Mark's the man.
Well, because I was just in Orlando, Florida. I did a fan convention there for Supernatural. So I am tired, but hey, man, I press on. I wanted to really hear this interview. So And I also had an audition this morning and came from there. So to make this, but I'm going to be in Toronto. I'm going to be in Toronto at the end of July, and you'll have an invitation to come to the Supernatural convention. I don't know if you like sci-fi stuff, but it's a show that's sci-fi oriented. But you can come if you're interested, and we'll talk fitness.
Very cool. The impression I get is that if you have a role in like a sci-fi or fantasy show or movie, like you're basically set for life by making appearances at conventions if all else fails. So if you guys need any like extras on one of these shows, it's just so I can get my face on camera and then go around doing photo ops at these nerd conventions, I would be grateful. Regina, thank you for the super chat, and thank you, Dylan, for the super chat. All right, those are all the super chats. I guess a final question for you, John. That the Bruce Lee project you did, is that the one where he keeps repeating karate comes from Kung Fu?
That was, I think, from his screen test in 1965. The interview that I owned and that made the bulk of the film, the bedrock narrative of the film, was the one where he says, "Be water, my friend." You know, the necessity to adapt in a combative situation.
Okay, so the thing you worked on is not full of like reenactments where like he's with his friends and they're getting approached by bad guys and Bruce Lee goes, "I'm not afraid of them. Karate comes from Kung Fu," you know, because the karate guys are challenging them. Okay, yeah. So what I said at the start of this conversation, saying that I was disappointed in your film when I was a kid, I actually wish to retract and apologize. I watched a completely different.
Bruce Lee, in his own words, my thought was that Bruce Lee was his own best spokesperson. And he was very charismatic. If you watch him, even in conversation, you're riveted. And so I thought, well, let's fashion a platform by which Bruce Lee can, you know, tell in his own words his story about his life, his art, and his film work. And that's what that film was about. And consequently, if you keep the focus on a guy who is fascinating and charismatic, there's never a dull moment. The problem when things get dull is when you bring a talking head in. He goes, "Well, you know, I had a coffee with Bruce once," and then you've lost him. But when you have a guy that has that kind of charisma, I mean, it's the old thing. He could read a phone book and you'd be glued to it. You know, so when he's talking about something he's passionate about, it's even more compelling. In fact, Bruce Lee, in his own words, was the film that I sent Leonard that convinced him to allow me to do Leonard Peikoff, in his own words.
And you saw Tarantino's depiction of Bruce Lee in his most recent movie, and what did you think of that? Was it?
Well, my first reaction was that, hey, it's a movie. You know, you can make Bruce Lee be whatever you want in your own movie. I don't care. And I like the ending of it, how he's, you know, staved off this brutal murder, and I thought that was really clever. My problem with Tarantino came when he attempted to defend his portrayal of Bruce Lee on Joe Rogan's podcast. Instead of saying, "Hey, listen, you know, guys, it's a movie. You know, it's a movie. You know, I could have had Brad Pitt's character beat up King Kong. It would be a movie. It doesn't mean it's real." But he didn't go that route. Instead, he said, "Well, Bruce Lee hated American stuntmen, and he was hitting stuntmen, so the producer called in a ringer, this judo Gene LaBelle, to come and teach him a lesson." And
I knew Gene LaBelle.
I knew Gene LaBelle too, but I also know that story is utter bullshit. You know, that because I knew Bruce's daytime diaries. I interviewed LaBelle. LaBelle told me he went to Bruce's school and they were going to work out there, but the mats were too thin, the tatami mats. So he had to go to Gene's school. Problem is, Bruce didn't have mats at all in the school. And number two, the school wasn't open when Bruce knew Gene LaBelle. The other thing was, Gene said, trained with him privately and secretly for an entire year. And yet Bruce never incorporated anything resembling what Gene LaBelle did in terms of judo or wrestling. It was Bruce Lee was the kind of guy, number one, he was a hair trigger guy. And if you tried to embarrass him on the set amongst his colleagues, there was going to be trouble. And Gene LaBelle, for all his AAU wrestling championships, is a big, strong, powerful, capable, grappler, no question about it. Very tough guy. But you have to understand, Bruce Lee's closing speed from 8 feet away was 5/100ths of a second. And what he practiced daily was finger jabs to the eyes, not to take eyes out, but to scratch the cornea. And he used to hang party masks that you would wear. And every night he'd do about 2,000 of those thrusts through the holes, the eye holes in that, till he got to the point where he could do that and the mask wouldn't move. So you've got 5/100ths of a second closing speed to the eyes. And that's his weapon. That's what he practiced. And according to Tarantino, LaBelle picked Bruce up and carried him around the set. Okay, maybe he did. I don't know. Van Williams, who was the star of the set and was there for every shot, never told me that. The producer, Charles Fitzsimons, never told me that. That'd be a pretty major incident. But, you know, the reality is Gene LaBelle did one episode of The Green Hornet, and it was episode 11. If this problem with stuntmen was occurring, why would you wait if you're the stunt director 11 episodes before you do something about it? And number two, you know the film world. If I'm the producer of the show and Bruce is hitting stuntmen and causing problems, and I find out that you have called in a ringer, a tough guy, to teach my co-star a lesson, you won't work on this in Hollywood again. You're done. Because if you hurt my guy, he's out. It costs the production money. Not going to happen. And if you're an aspiring stuntman like Gene LaBelle, you're not working again. So the whole story to me is complete and utter nonsense. And the other thing is, when I worked at the estate, I had access to Bruce Lee's daytime diaries, and they were very comprehensive. I knew and could see who he met with, what he did every day of the week from 1966 to 1973. Interestingly enough, Gene LaBelle's name doesn't show up once. Not once. He didn't have his phone number, didn't have the address of his school. And that to me is very suspicious for someone that LaBelle claims went to his school for an entire year to train.
So LaBelle's fibbing.
Yeah.
He was fibbing. Well, you know,
you got to understand about LaBelle too, though, is that this guy he's a self-promoter par excellence. He came from the wrestling background. His mom was in the wrestling background. So he knows how to play the heel, right? And this does not diminish. This is the problem I have with martial arts. Most martial artists feel that they can't advance themselves without diminishing someone else. I saw it with Chuck Norris, I saw it with Bob Wall, I saw it with Gene LaBelle, I saw it with Jun Rhee. The guy who impressed me the most from a grappling perspective in martial arts was a guy named Hayward Nishioka. He was a 4-time AAU champion. He was a Pan Am gold medalist in judo. Very, very, and a black belt in karate, Shotokan. This guy is, like, if you want a judoka, this guy's as good as it gets. And like I say, he won the AAU title twice as many times as LaBelle did. So he was good. And he told me, he said, there's nothing I could do on Bruce. He would shut me down before I could do anything. And he said, and finally I got so frustrated, he said that I told him, I said, you know, my world is the ground. That's where I dominate. He said, what would you do if I lay on the ground and you had to come to me? And he said, Bruce looked at him and said, well, I wouldn't do anything. I'd just walk away. But then Bruce said, but don't get up. You know, and that's the thing. Bruce was a striker. He knew that if he was up against a guy like yourself, that if you grabbed him, it's 50-50 now. And it's probably going to favor you because you're bigger and stronger. So he wasn't interested in getting in a roll and submission type thing. His thing was, how do you end this as quickly as possible? And what he went for were the things that didn't get stronger through training. Your throat, your eyes, your groin, your knee. Those were his targets. And he had no interest in sport competition. He was, for whatever his reasons, he was interested in how can I defend myself in the street, because that's where something's going to go down. And I compiled recently, going through all the interviews that I've done and the research I've done of his street record, and he was 36-0. And as far as sparring goes, you can throw another 27-0 on that, because he sparred professional boxers like Joey Orbio. He sparred heavyweight karate guys like Joe Louis. grapplers like Hayward Nishioka. No one ever got to him. So,
but grappling is so sophisticated now. How do you think he would have fared against an in his prime MMA guy who's got great grappling and great striking?
It just depends. I mean, again, grappling, it's true that that's changed. And you've got Brazilian jiu-jitsu now, and you've got mixed martial arts. So you got guys who can kick, they can strike, they can grapple. These are dangerous guys. But the thing that with Bruce is you're still dealing with a human being. You know, let's say this guy's got this great grappling knowledge, and you take his eyes out. Now what do you got? You got a sitting duck. And the problem, Bruce also understood lag time. So if I move to you to strike you, your subconscious is immediately processing what's going on before it formulates what a response is, either stepping back out of the way, intercepting me, maybe blocking me, maybe hitting me. All these things are going through your subconscious, and that takes time. Not a lot of time, but it takes time. And Bruce knew that. So when he launched an attack, it was non-telegraphic, and again, a closing speed of 5/100ths of a second, and probably going for your eyes. And now you got to respond to it. That's tough for anyone, no matter what your discipline, to deal with. How would he do in an octagon? Not well. You've taken away most of his tools. You can't bite, you can't eye gouge, you can't kick in the groin, you can't kick a guy in the head when he's down. You've got a referee that's going to step in if it gets one-sided. You got a corner man, you get a rest. I mean, that wasn't his world, you know. As he said, once you strap on gloves, you're dealing in rules. And his idea was that fighting, qua fighting, should be no rules. It's whatever you need to do to survive. And that's how he trained. And unlike a lot of people that pay lip service to that concept, he lived it. I mean, this guy trained like an MMA fighter, but not just for 8 weeks prior to a big bout. He trained that way 365 days a year. So he was psychologically, there was something going on there, because he always anticipated a fight. There's always going to be a fight. Whoever he saw, he was measuring the guy up. When he went out to eat lunch, I remember Mito Uehara used to publish Black Belt magazine, telling me he had lunch with Bruce, and during lunch, Bruce would be going, and Mito was going like, Bruce, what the hell are you doing? You know, and Bruce said, sorry, I'm looking at the guy behind you eating there, and I'm trying to come in on the half beat when he's moving his fork to his mouth. So again, it was broken rhythm. It was all fight related stuff. He would sit in his office and have 2 tape recorders hooked up to a headset, and one ear, loud traffic noises, airplanes taking off, and the other one, the slow, soft drip of water. And he would crank the traffic noises up, but focus so he could only hear the water drop. And the reason he did that was that, by his explanation, was you are fastest and able to react the quickest when you're totally relaxed, when you're almost asleep. So if I can relax my mind, I can react much quicker. So this is not a normal guy, right? This is not a martial arts type of guy who, you know, hey, we had a good match, shake hands, and they go for beer or something afterwards. This was a guy that was deadly serious about it, and good enough, despite what Norris et al. Had said afterwards, that they went to him for instruction. They might tell the media that he was just a movie guy, but a martial arts world champion doesn't go and study with a movie guy. And the only reason they would have gone to study with him is because Bruce would have told them or shown them what he had. So,
hey, I mean, Chuck Norris is the real deal, but when you see the two of them together, Bruce Lee makes him look like he's standing still. I mean,
yeah, no, and that's the thing. Like for me, I used to be a fan. I didn't know much about martial arts until I studied it, but I thought my eyes didn't deceive me. This guy's very good. It's exceptional. But then the martial artist came out like Chuck Norris saying, well, he was an actor. You know, I was a world champion. He didn't mention he was a world champion of non-contact, but he was a world champion. Bruce was an actor. And other guys would tell me how they, you know, taught Bruce how to kick, and another guy taught me how Bruce couldn't really fight, and was this and that. And it was only when I really got into my research on Bruce and saw documents within his estate and that you could see the reality of it. People that claim that they were tight with him and taught him, they're not even in his daytime diaries. People that, the claim they taught him how to kick high, and then I see footage of him in, 1962 kicking above his head. And it's like, well, you didn't meet him till 67. So how'd you teach him how to kick high, But it seems to be an attitude, and you probably experience this in martial arts, that everybody's sifu or everybody's sensei is the deadliest guy on the planet. He can kill anybody, and you don't want to get on his bad side. And same thing, he didn't compete because he was too lethal and he'd kill you and all this sort of nonsense. Bruce Lee was a guy that a lot of martial artists would cross the street when he came down, which is odd because he's 5'7.5" and $138. But he was, as Bob Wall told me once, he said, it was with Bruce, he said it was not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. And there was a lot of fight in Bruce Lee. And I almost think it's a primal thing in a fight. It's why we tend to have almost a reflex that if a guy is bigger, you walk a little softer, because in a subconscious level what kind of energy output you're going to have to engage in to surmount that. And it's the same thing, guys, I'm sure you do, guys that you can see in their eyes that you don't want to mess with this guy. Sonny Liston apparently was like that. Mike Tyson and his friend Roberto Duran was like that. You just knew that you were in a lot of trouble, and you'd better be willing to have the fight of your life and output the most amount of energy you've ever output in your life just to emerge unscathed. And I think we can read that. We've all, been around people when a legitimately tough guy comes in, and you just know this is not a guy you're going to take lightly. And I think Bruce Lee was like that as well. He reminds me of Roberto Duran, actually. There was that savagery to it when he went. And anyway, I'm sorry, it was a long-winded rant, but
yeah, I haven't wanted to interrupt, even though we've gone over time. But yeah, I'm like that too, by the way. People don't want to mess with me.
I was going to say that.
Yeah. Okay. But one final question to both of you. Mark, which historical figure would you want to play? Asks Katie. And she asks John, whose story should be told that hasn't?
You want to go first, Mark?
You go ahead first, John, and I'll think of
a historical figure.
No. Well, yeah, any person alive or dead whose story should be told the way you've told other people's stories.
I would like to do Mike Mentzer's story. I just don't think there'd be a huge audience for it, but to me, it would be fascinating. It's there's a lot of human interest. I mean, there was a rise and a fall and a resurrection, and how people deal with adversity fascinates me. You show me somebody who has never had a problem in their life, has never missed a payment. I can't relate to that person. Show me someone who's been knocked down by life, but somehow has found a way to get back up. And not only that, but to succeed. And you got my attention, because I can relate to the getting knocked down part. Now I want to see how a human being surmounts these obstacles. That fascinates me. So in Mike, I see plenty of that. And that to me would be the fascinating aspect.
And the Mike Mentzer you describe, I think, would tell you you're going to make the audience for it. So make the project, and if you build it, they will come.
Build the baseball diamond, and they will come.
Yeah. And if you need to call the documentary like Arnold Sucks or the anti-Schwarzenegger, there's no harm in that. Mark, have you thought of have you played a real person in your career?
I have, but I wouldn't call that person honorable. I played Dick Hickok, who is one of the two killers in the famous story made famous by Truman Capote in Cold Blood. So I did it in the film Capote. I played Dick Hickok. So I wouldn't call that a figure that I would necessarily want to see on film and try to do justice to. But since this is more an objectivist forum, I do think that Helen Mirren did not do justice to Ayn Rand when she played Ayn Rand, and she's a fantastic actress. So I would like to see somebody portray Ayn Rand in a way that makes her the sympathetic character and the intellectual giant that she really was, and I think that could change quite a few minds.
Yeah,
that would be a fascinating thing to see. All right, what an episode! This was fantastic. Coming up at 9 p.m. UK time, it's HBTV with Harry Binswanger on refuting Kant. Consciousness is conscious.
You never get tired of that. Yeah.
This is what the video game kids call the final boss, fellas. Exactly. Kant is it. You know, he took that that is-ought dichotomy and exploited it and used it to become what Ayn Rand, I think, called the most wicked and influential philosopher until now. So catch that right here on Ayn Rand Center UK. This is it, folks. You think Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris is intense? Wait till you see Binswanger versus Kant. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, John. Hope to have you back here soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, fellows. It was a pleasure speaking to both of you.
Pleasure. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
And goodbye.